Welcome. We're here to discuss the power of sound design and storytelling and how a director uses sound to best enhance their films. I'm your host, Stephen Fine. I'm a post-production supervisor and a writer-director. I'm here with Melody Gunn's lead sound designer, Thomas Uzio. Today, we're discussing Test Pattern, an award-winning film that just released to high praises from audiences and critics, including The New Yorker and Rolling Stone. IndieWire has dubbed this the must-see indie gem of 2021, and it currently sits on Rotten Tomatoes at 95%. Today, we have joining us the writer and director, Shatara Michelle Ford. Thanks for being with us, Shatara.
Hey, thanks for having me, Stephen.
Of course. Congratulations on the release and the amazing reception.
Thank you.
I've seen the movie twice now, and I absolutely loved it. Since we're here talking about sound, I do want to talk about the tone and the sound of the film and how that evolved from writing the movie to shooting it and the post process for you.
Yeah, well, I'm a type of filmmaker that likes to use all of my tools in the toolbox to express an idea, especially when it relates to a character's internal experience or processing of an experience. Really influenced by like German expressionism in particular, but also just kind of like the ways in which, more like classical and neoclassical filmmakers used score and sound altogether. Because for me, like if I can avoid dialogue to express an idea, I'm going to. And the way that that looked like in the script is that it was a relatively short script, so it's 35 pages long, and some of that was a part of the technique of working with my actors, as in we did a lot of rehearsal and creation of character together that kind of helped expand scenes and ideas. The script was also really short because I knew the role that silence was going to have to play in it. As in, since I'm interacting with realism, um, it's important to kind of let human beings arrive at an idea or at a moment on their own time. And so I didn't want to pack so much into the script plot wise that we didn't have time for, you know, my actors to kind of have the agency to choose when they were going to finally decide to say something, if they say something at all. So yeah, silence has a lot to do with that, which again, very much related to sound. And then when, there were always moments where I always are on the side of subtlety. And so if there's something that I'm not letting my character explicitly say, it was a note that I made to myself that, well, this is still a point that I need to have the audience have at least some sort of like felt understanding of, if it's not fully kind of like identified and tangible. So again, that's where I rely on sound. And so the film wouldn't be what it is in any way without, the relationship that I had with Thomas and the role that he played in that film. But I think more than anything, the film also wouldn't have been able to add that layer for the audience. As in, I think there's a lot in Renisha's experience that we understand on a much more kind of like emotional level than it is intellectual, because there's extra inputs that are like contributing to that. And I think on further reflection or conversation with a friend or on second and third viewings, you can dial it in and identify it more, but in that moment all you know is the feeling. And I think that helps you kind of sit in her body a little bit better. You're kind of experiencing it as she's experiencing it. And so there's this kind of relational real-time processing of the situation itself, which I think is important, and again just couldn't have been done without sound.
Yeah, I mean, the sound design I thought was incredible. It is what made me feel the most, because I do love the script and the way you set up the circumstance, but the characters never really say how they feel that it's all being told to you from those moments where she's sitting in silence, being isolated, or listening to Snoopy, be very, abrasive throughout the day. So Thomas, what was your experience watching it for the first time? And what were some of the things that were brought up during the spotting session that you remember?
Yeah, I mean, the first time I watched it, all these things we kind of talked about, I was really struck by the gray nature of the characters. Sorry, in terms of they're real people, they feel like real people, and they don't always make the right choice, but you always understand why they would do what they're doing. And so, ultimately it feels like a true story because by the end there is no happy ending. It's like, they both have gone through this thing and they feel like they're on different paths now. We don't know what's going to happen, but that's kind of the key thing. So, when we talked in the spotting and all that, a lot of things that she brought up, we just kind of went all in about what is the feeling in these silences and how can these great performances shine. We don't have to do like a lot to try to like um, aggrandize it. We can sit with them and make it feel very real. And in those quiet moments, you're really projecting a lot what you're feeling as well. I think a male viewer might have a different experience than a female viewer,
Mhm.
and by the end, you realize just how different we might think about things. And I agree. When you first see it, you feel the kind of you understand the rage, but you also understand that that rage is not necessarily conducive to the to the right thing that Renisha wants.
Yeah.
So that was definitely something we talked about a lot, and all the kind of themes that led to the kind of story that Shatara wanted to tell. Like she said, all those conversations don't necessarily show up in like a specific way, but you feel them throughout the whole film. And by the end, you kind of like, after the sequence at the bar, everything feels very lonely and feels very um, quiet because there's this underlying tension just by being quiet of this thing
Mhm.
unsaid between the two of them, and that they're both trying to fix it in their own way, and they're not communicating. Like the film is very much about communication, the lack thereof, and uh, once again with the idea of kind of American culture that does feel like something, especially in America, we have this repressed sensibility of wanting to feel strong all the time, of wanting to, hide from these kind of vulnerable emotions. And maybe we should confront them more often and be more open to discussing them because it can avoid a lot of unnecessary pain. Um, and it's beautiful that that's not really said, but you just understand that kind of feeling through the film. Um, but yeah, I mean, all that stuff, you're always very lucky to work with talented filmmakers who, when you get the cut, you feel that even when the edit. Um, and they brought it to us, and we felt that immediately. And then we went to work enhancing that as much as we could. And the score as well, was phenomenal. One thing we talked about with Shatara was like, using kind of Hitchcockian things where you're not really doing as much with design necessarily, but using the music. So we ended up mixing the music in a way that was sound designy, but without needing to like uh, you know unnecessarily overload the experience, but you could use it to kind of twist and modulate the experience to kind of match the emotion and the experience we're looking for. So that was a lot of
Yeah.
fun.
And that's exactly right. It's been many years now. Um,
It's been a
and I definitely have pandemic brain, but
while.
that is totally right. It's been funny, the film's been out for like 6 weeks now, and it was on the festival circuit for like 18 months before then. And there's always somebody that's like, this the sound, everything was just too loud and it was just a lot. And like, I don't know how I feel about it. And it's like, I remember, in that spotting session, like, especially, I mean, because all of the sound folks and editorial folks were there. I mean, the post folks,
Mm,
everybody. So I remember the kind of conversation just amongst you, me, and Rob Brucely about the fact that this is going to be a choice, like almost the score itself, the design and the relationship the design has with it, um, is is bold enough to live on its own. And then there's going to be times when like the actors are acting on top of it.
mm.
or that it's like it's like right alongside with it. And I think contemporary indie film in particular, like scores are really brought down, sound design's really brought down, and it kind of sits in the background and hums a little bit if it's there at all. And so, again, there's this thought, like this Hitchcockian thought of like, how are you working on top? Like, how are they kind of competing on top of each other? And one of the choices when we're bringing it up beyond what's actually happening in front of us, and then kind of pushing it, smashing it inside. I don't think there's really any point where the score and its design choices are behind the action or beneath it. It's always kind of like completely braided in or layered on top, which, yes, is very much a choice. And I think for folks who aren't expecting that and maybe aren't necessarily used to that, it's jarring. And I think that's fair. But then the question goes back to like why that exists to begin with. And I think what we also talked a lot about in that spotting session was like, you know, or at least maybe it was in my head and I thought I was, no, you can confirm if I actually like communicated that well. But constantly for me, as a Black person and as a woman, feeling very alienated from most of the spaces that I'm in, I'm always having kind of like a more detailed, specific internal conversation that nobody else is really part of. And I think that what I was hoping that the sound was doing was expressing that kind of experience that I have onto the screen. And so when things are really, really loud, that's like Renisha's, overall kind of feeling in relation to the environment that she's in. Again, I'm not sure if that was actually articulated, but I just feel like there were a couple of moments when, I think in later, sessions where I'd ask you kind of like to turn it up a little bit. I was like, just push that up just a little bit more. Like, okay, cool. Like I don't know, but cool, but yeah.
I think the characters feel so real and I guess the writing and the performing of it, but the experience felt cinematic. Like you're talking about raising that music and how it integrates with the sound design. I have noticed in indie films it being a lot lower and it doesn't engage me as much. And maybe I'm the type of audience who kind of loves some in your face expressionistic filmmaking. And that's what this felt like, expressionistic filmmaking, where you're truly immersed in the experience.
I also think, by the nature of it being a very quiet film, you have more room for dynamics. So like, it's funny too, because like in a lot of the quiet scenes, Shatara, you were actually doing the opposite. You were like, can we actually take that down a little bit? And it's because we wanted to
it was like
in.
even,
You want to lean in. And then when it did get big, you were like, oh, damn, this is like, you feel it. And then, like once again, the sequence of the bar, and then it kind of flows into this low end thing that is quiet, but you feel under the surface, and with that like kind of soft wind, all these little things build into that experience and enhance each other to get you into that headspace.
Going back to the expressionistic thing, and it's interesting. I definitely play in realism, and like I really appreciate and find necessity in realism, especially when you're talking about folks that aren't in the mainstream. I think it's slightly irresponsible to be kind of fantastical with that, because right now, like there's not enough of our experience in the zeitgeist for us, for outsiders to be able to parse what's fantastical and like surreal and out there and not, grounded in truth. And so, as much as it's realistic, the expressionistic thing, I think, is me saying, y'all, this is a movie. This is not a documentary, this is a movie. And so therefore I'm editorializing a little bit here, and I'm letting you know that these are the specific things that I want you to see and that I want you to hear and I want you to feel. And you can disagree about my choices in that, but maybe wonder why I'm doing it. Like, let's have a conversation about why I'm doing it and how that relates to the people that you're looking at on screen. And I don't know, I think that's that's something that I really appreciate and I really miss um, in this like moment that we're in cinema where you've got like the contemporary like blockbuster studio films that are all just like 11s.
Mm.
You know, everything is just like up, up, up. And then, you know, the indie stuff where it's like we're just kind of here with this person and we're experiencing this thing with this person. And very rarely are we getting the editorialization of like what that person's experience is and
Mm.
how they relate to the rest of the world, which is something that I think that like New Hollywood did in like the late 60s, early 70s really well.
Mm.
You know, like I constantly go back to, you know, thinking about like, I don't know, Dog Day Afternoon or Taxi Driver
Mm.
or, you know, Midnight Cowboy as films that are very much steeped in like this element of realism, but there's a lot of extra stuff going on in the design, in the mise en scène, in the soundtrack that's kind
Mm.
of like getting the audience to a place. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to bring up so I mean, obviously the meet cute and their whole relationship developing it that those elements didn't feel as heightened as
No.
later points in the movie. It feels like more you're in a real relationship that's developing. And obviously once the incident occurs, I'm even like happy with how Evan is handling it at first. He's quiet and he's understanding, and you see him slowly losing control of that, trying to help her and then like veering it into his own motives. And as that's happening, he gets louder and louder. The scenes
Mm-hmm.
start to get more chaotic and more chaotic. So I
Mm-hmm.
kind of wanted to discuss like the juxtaposition of the kind of more realistic sounding scenes, you know, when before the incident, and then how that changes after the incident, and how kind of the progression of the different hospitals grow as well in sound
Yeah.
design.
Yeah, for sure. Well, first, you know, there's the other thing that I have to say, which is, you know, I've said that the movie's about all these things, but another thing that it's very much about is trauma and how trauma is internalized and processed. And so some of that just has, you know, I think about the majority of the expressionistic moments in the film, they're very much tied to a place in Renisha's kind of lived experience on screen where she has had this trauma and she's working through it or existing within it, right? I think that like Evan's journey from them having the conversation back at Amber's house to going to the first hospital and the second hospital and the third hospital is also its own version of trauma. I think Evan's experiencing his own trauma, but also the way that he's expressing his stress is putting more trauma onto Renisha. And so again, that's why there's so much of this cacophony within the design itself and the score and Renisha's overall kind of like expression as projected cinematically, if that makes any sense. But like if we roll back and we just talk about like the first section being the, you know, what can sometimes be read as a romantic comedy, the, you know, the meet cute element of the story. That's also a device that I was using, right? Like I think when you, um, for me, I was trying to make a very specific point about what is wrong. And I don't think that you can make a good point about something being wrong until you show something being done right. And you can compare and contrast the two. And so the first 20 minutes is very much like a kind of place setting, so you understand where all of the pieces are, what's supposed to feel good, what is correct in the world, what feels grounded and real within this construct that I've created for the audience. And even like if, you know, we're skipping over like, you know, the first couple of minutes where we see Renisha and Mike, and we don't really know who they are to each other. We don't really know what's going on. But that to me was, I needed to put that first intentionally so we understood like, this is information that you have. without any kind of editorialization. It's just so you have it, just so you know it's here. And then we move on to this meet cute with Evan and Renisha. And again, it's like, this is information you need to know about these people. They come from these opposite places. They interact in these very specific ways. They miss each other many times, even early on. So if I'm telling you that they miss each other, even when things are good, imagine what it looks like when things are bad.
Right.
And then on top of that too, within this very like basic, stark, uneditorialized, unexpressed realism, we have them negotiating and navigating elements of, you know, boundaries and autonomy and consent. So that's what that, you know, initial point is. And then we go into the second section, which is again very established and very rooted. However, the colors kind of are informing us of like a very different emotional state for the two of them. And things really just kind of go haywire into like once we're in the bar and Renisha is experiencing what I would argue the first elements of like her trauma. And again, that's like a much more kind of like gender-based and racialized trauma in the sense of they're in this bar that's with a culture that's very different to their own. And it doesn't feel fully, you know, normal. And like truly, again, as a Black person, like that's me in like most white spaces. They're just like surreal as hell. And like, so, you know, I feel like I move through like, you know, a Lynch movie a day. So that was the kind of idea of the bar, right? Like, you know, in the best of times, it's just a David Lynch movie. And the worst of times, it's turning into this like horror thing that's going on the other side. And that Renisha kind of inches her way into. And so I think that like from the moment that she's lost all control of herself, that's when we slip into this much more specific and deliberate expressionist technique. Because again, like she no longer is able to kind of speak for herself, and she's now just gone into herself, and so everything that she's experiencing is heightened, but also deeply internal. So it's heard and it's felt, but it's not discussed.
It's like literally that's literally the lines we use usually to discuss the power of sound design. And it was one of the reasons we loved, you know, working on this movie, obviously, was the ability to maximize those moments. And once again, that doesn't mean like everything's at 10. It's like, you know, getting someone to interact in a visceral way that's subconscious is one of the powers of sound to really change the entire vibe without you ever thinking about it. So, you know, all the room tones we were choosing were very specific to make sure that all these scenes, you know, and you were talking about the hospitals, each of them having their different vibe. And, you know, the loudest one seems to be the last one, where it's pretty quiet. It just feels like, you know, they're both screaming at each other internally. Like, why can't you just do what I want you to do? It'll just solve the problem. That's like Evan's kind of feeling. She's just like, can we just get out of here? Because I want nothing to do with this. I need to go, you know, cover from and try to deal with this. And it's just really well executed.
Yeah, I think that's the other thing that's like very funny is that, you know, there's definitely a few timelines going on in the film, and the editorial timeline that, you know, I was working from is much more of like an internal processing timeline for Renisha, which is its own thing. And that's a conversation I'm also having about trauma, is that, you know, you never arrive at a point, you know, in a linear way. And it's never at a time that you can control or expect. It just kind of arrives when it arrives. And you know, the three hospitals themselves, the room tone is slightly different, of course, because they're different sizes of spaces that we're working in. But ultimately, you know, there's not much else going on in them, but it feels like it is because it's sandwiched in between things that were much bigger or much more extreme.
Mhm.
And I think that's really cool, right? And so the third one, I think, is, as Tom's already mentioned, feels so loud, but that's because the emotions that were even brought into that space were like at their highest point. And then there's other things like, you know, we have Waltz of the Flowers playing in the third one. It goes on for such a long time. And that's kind of me. I mean, there's a few things that I'm doing. But on a sound level, I'm about to cleanse the palette, right? So we've moved from these really like high like scenes with them in the car. They just kind of done that, ridiculous, rush through the second hospital, and Renisha's had to pee in this cup, and it's just all ridiculous. And like, so the idea for me was that I'm going to bring it all the way up here because I'm going to take it completely away in a second. And that's me saying, you need to pay attention to this thing that's about to happen. That's going to feel really, really awful. And I think that without having this like sonic cacophony kind of eliminated really abruptly, we wouldn't feel the tension as much. And I don't think that like, Renisha dropping that pea cup would be as devastating or feel as embarrassing. Especially like, I'm sure we've all had this, but think about a moment when you're with like a sibling or a parent or a friend, significant other, and y'all are just like deeply embroiled in your own personal thing, and it feels really big, but you're like at the post office,
Yeah.
and so like everyone else around you, like we're not a part of it, but like it's not, so it doesn't feel as big to anyone outside of it as it does to you. And then there's always that like jarring moment of where you recognize that you're having this like very heated thing publicly.
Yeah.
And that was again the idea that I was going with in the third hospital, right? Like that pea cup dropping does a couple of things. It kind of snaps them out of that little world that they're in too, to kind of recognize how everything else around them is relatively silent in that moment. And that's kind of like isolating and alienating on its own. So yeah.
No, and also Evan comes out of that with like kind of like being like, oh man. I mean, obviously it doesn't necessarily result in immediately improving his how he's acting, but he definitely has that moment of like, oh, I'm kind of like making this worse.
The sequence where they're walking in slow motion to the music and how heightened that is, because it like immediately told me to pay attention, but also I thought it was sort of ironic about how epic this moment felt for her filling out this paperwork, and how he was positioning himself to her and making her fill out this paperwork. And it was really like, because I think there was a moment where I recognize it reminded me of Kubrick in 2001. And it's like, yeah, you can see a spaceship going to this music, but also this moment of her filling out this paperwork is as big as a spaceship.
Yeah, and there's another read of those sequences in 2001 where it's routine and monotonous, right? Like this idea of something being so big and complex and like like especially for the time, like wow, but like it just has this kind of like pattern that it does.
Yeah.
And it's like a waltz, right? It's just like we all know what we're expected to do when this happens. Okay, we hit the beats, we do it. It's almost mindless, methodical.
It's almost an inevitable feeling, it's like they have to go through these things. And also what's great about that piece as a choice was like, if you watch Evan, you get almost like the hero's journey version.
Yes.
If you watch her, you're like, this, I can't believe I have to do this, but I'm just going to do it. And now I'm just doing it. There's this like inevitable feeling
completely. And again, that it's absurd, right? And that's another thing that I thought was important in that moment. Like, it's as long as it is, it's that score for a specific reason, all to kind of remind you that this is ridiculous. It's
it works so well. It works so well, and I just love I love using songs that might be recognizable and then giving it a new context. And I thought that was so well done at that part. I do want to go back to the incident of when she was drugged and that whole sequence of events, and ask Thomas about how you guys developed the sound design of that being drugged and going through that very traumatic experience before we even get into bringing Evan in.
Yeah, I mean that sequence is very music driven, like we talked about. I mean, it's all about modulation too. We start in a very real place, this bar that feels uncomfortable and just alien a little bit, where nothing feels quite comfortable for her. And then he kind of like loosens her up and makes her feel like, oh, maybe we can like have some fun, innocent fun that'll just like be able to get me through this. And you know, we'll go home. And then obviously throughout the sequence, the music starts to shift and the intensity, you know, we lose the diegetic music. It starts to become this score piece that feels sweeping and like you're losing yourself, you know, it's like feels like you get lost. And we start to really like mess with the mixing and like add some reverb and stuff like that to make it feel even more like this thing that's out of our control, more so than before. And it just keeps crescendoing
Yeah.
until we get, you know, and it gets more and more lost, more and more reverb towards the end, and then we lose ourselves and just glide into this car. And it's like, where are we now? We're just like here, it just kind of happened. You know, we talked a lot about how to kind of make that sequence feel sonically like your experience, you know, perspective based, but using the music really as the kind of like driving force, as a cinematic tool, for sure.
I remember too, and correct me if I'm wrong, Thomas, but I feel like just knowing myself, I feel like, we also took a lot of stuff out.
Oh
There
yeah,
was a lot
we tried
of,
also stuff.
yeah,
We tried to use design more, and it just didn't help, you know. And that's one of the
yeah,
things, you know, where you're just like, well, you try it and see how it feels, because maybe it was great, maybe it would have really amplified the scene, and it didn't.
yeah,
And we were
sure.
just like, yeah, this scene wants to be what it is. And once again, the score was phenomenal, so it didn't need more to tell this story, and it also allows, you know, the first of all, just from a feeling perspective, feels cinematic, and you just kind of get lost in the image, which is, you know, beautifully shot. And then you kind of let the performances do the work. I mean, it's one of those things when you get great material, you're just trying to amplify and not getting in the way of things too.
Mhm,
Is, you know, the choice to not do something is just as important as the choice to do something,
mhm,
because it all
mhm.
changes the experience.
I'm glad that you brought that scene up, and especially those elements, because I remember the ways in which we use sound to kind of, what I mean, it's painful and awkward, and I don't mean those things in kind of like the, cringe comedy ways. I mean it
Mhm.
really in like the deeply
Yeah.
vulnerable, and there's a moment where, Drew's character Mike has, where he realizes he's done something wrong and he could own up to it,
Yeah.
and he's thinking about it, and instead he does the really terrible gaslighty
Yeah.
thing of like doubling down. And the way in which he doubles down is with, again, like, uh what's the word, passive aggression.
Mhm.
So I remember us kind of, hearing the cup, hearing the shoes drop on the floor, like all of these things that like are definitely like just bumped up a bit because it's trying to like underline the point that it's passive aggression.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like he's
um
irritated
yeah.
with
Yeah.
her for what
Yeah.
he's done.
Yes.
And it's like it's so obnoxious. And then there's that one moment where you think he's having some recognition of his part in it, and he says like, I just, and then he stops. And he's
Mhm.
like, let's go. Like you're
Mhm.
inconveniencing me to drive you to your friend. It's oh, it's so sickening. But yeah, I mean, that worked so well in just feeling his perspective on the situation. He's clearly angry and irritated, but it's almost like projection.
Yes.
He's irritated with himself, but he's projecting it onto her.
Completely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and I think again, like those little passive aggressive acts that we just kind of nail within this bed of silence is so good for
Yeah,
that.
and then he just speeds away, trying to escape as quickly as he can from the
Ugh,
repercussions of his acts. I mean, it's yeah,
that
it's
was
great.
such an aggro speed away too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, he's like,
But it was
Oh
like
my God.
it was like a weak aggro speed. It was like a sloppy one. It wasn't like one of
yeah,
those like
yeah.
movie
Just like, oh,
ones.
I'm not sure
It's
about it.
it,
Oh,
it's like
definitely.
yeah, he couldn't fully even commit to speeding away because he's so unsure of himself now as a
Yes.
human
Yeah,
being.
yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's what we do. Yeah,
So I wanted to talk about the fact that I heard pretty much little to no ADR in this movie, and how important it was for you on set preserving that production audio, no matter what, and making sure you had kind of the clearest voices, or even if that was even a concern. But I did notice that, like, I mean, particularly with, you know, their conversations and how specifically sometimes you would need to hear it or not hear it, how preserving production audio was important.
Yeah, you know, Stephen, I don't know if that's true. There was a good amount of ADR. They're just good
Really?
at their job. They're just good at
Wow.
their job.
We'll never
Thomas.
tell. We'll never tell.
Thomas.
No, but I mean, you always want to get performances from the day. I mean, when the characters and the actors are in it, that's what you want, you know. But you know,
Mhm.
as long as we can. But honestly, we didn't do very much. There were some.
Didn't.
But there were clutch things we did have to do.
Absolutely.
But no, keeping all those performances and the nuances, like we said, being able to save things that we didn't even realize were there that actually really enhanced the scene. But you know, like we said before, you know, it's like you're making all these little choices to keep something or not keep it. You know, like while she finally gets the rape kit test, and it's almost pure silence. We don't hear anything, and you know, the choice to not have anything there, same kind of thing.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
but yeah, Shatara, sorry, go ahead.
I think the one scene that I think about a lot, and I stressed over, was the scene in the bar with Amber and Renisha talking about all of the, you know, recent like police murders and death of Black people in Texas and outside of Texas, but specifically Texas. And I actually had to, so when I wrote it, two more had happened between me writing it and shooting it. And I remember on the day I was shooting it, I like threw another one in for Gail to say. But then between us shooting it and recording ADR, there had been another one. And so it was hard to kind of like squeeze that in, but I thought it was really important to squeeze it in. And thankfully, you know, there's enough cutting back and forth um, of just kind of Renisha scoping her surroundings and her reaction to, you know, what Amber was saying, that I think just got away with it. I was never fully happy with that scene, but it was worth still adding it in because I think it was important to like recognize that this happens so frequently.
Yeah.
So that was one that, you know, very much based on just getting information in there to add to the gravity. And it's funny too, like the people who appreciate it are the people who already know that's a thing. The people who kind of like, you know, why are they having this conversation in this bar? Like this seems, they're usually the ones that don't recognize or appreciate how constant this thing is and
Yeah.
how much it actually does affect, you know, folks within the group. I think another part where the ADR was really important was, again, it's something that we don't see, we only hear it, but it's the conversation that Amber and Evan are having while Renisha is waking up and walking towards them. Um, it was, you know, they were having that conversation, but it just wasn't fully picked up because even when we shot it, I was focused on Renisha kind of catching it in the background, as
Mhm.
opposed to like us actually sitting with it and having that footage. Um, and that was a decision because I wanted the experience to constantly be from her. And I thought that if I actually shot that scene with Evan and Amber, I would have the urge to cut back and forth. And I just
Yeah.
didn't want to. But what we missed is that you just can't, we're just not set up to fully hear it.
Yeah.
And so that was an important point where I kind of had to make sure that, you know, we got Gail and Will back in there and had that conversation again, so we could
Yeah.
hear it really clearly.
Yeah, it was really
I
important in the
understand
mix.
you not go ahead, Thomas.
Oh, sorry, I was just gonna say it was important in the mix too to get that right balance of, you know, hearing keywords and then dipping it down so that you're like, wait, what is because
Yeah.
you want to catch it, and
Mhm.
as the audience, you know, and also as Renisha, and so we're able to kind of control the amount of just interactivity so that you could kind of like, you know, feel more involved in that moment as
Yeah.
well, and from her perspective, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely understand the desire to not shoot it because you're afraid you might try to lean on it later. And I've made a
Mhm.
similar mistake with that. But like, even when you're there on set, like you put just a mic under them and have them have the conversation off camera, and then later you have that option to bring it up or down. But like not filming it makes complete sense to me, because you don't want to be in that room until Renisha's in that room.
Yeah.
But that audio,
Exactly.
having that full audio and being able to play with it is definitely essential to the construction of it.
I mean, it's a great creative choice too, because you could
Yeah.
also see that scene being very effective if you saw it. You know, there is a version where someone else might shoot it, but the creative choice to not shoot it is, like we were saying, is just as important. To just not show it. You're kind of restricted from this other perspective as Renisha in that moment as well. And they're cut off from her.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your insight into your process and this beautiful movie. We really appreciate you being here. Working with post-production sound can sometimes be a little of a mystery to directors, and we're just trying to kind of hopefully change that through these conversations and help demystify the process. So thank you so much for giving us that insight. If you haven't caught Test Pattern yet, it's out in theaters and digital cinemas through Kino Lorber, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks so much, Shatara.
Thanks,
Thank
Shatara.
you.